Катя, я тобі зроблю unmute, да, а потім зроблю тебе mute, коли ти закінчиш свою частину. Да? Домовились.
Ну що, починаємо.
Добре, зараз я всіх під'єдную.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. Our webinar today is called Debt Restructuring, Doing It Right, and it is a series of Restructuring Wednesdays, a series of webinars which we are going to hold each Wednesday until the end of the year during 2020. So we start with the basic webinar regarding debt restructuring and how to do it right, and how we expect actually the debt restructuring to happen in this year. And we will describe key issues which we are going to see in restructuring processes during this year and maybe for the few years that will come. So today we have three speakers: myself, Igor Olechov, the head of Banking and Finance at CMS, Cameron McKenna, Nabarro Olsvang. We have Katerina Chichulina, counsel of our Banking and Finance practice, and Christina Korpan. We are going to cover several topics during our presentations relating to restructurings. And at the end of our webinar, we will have 10 minutes to answer your questions. So if you have any questions during the process of our webinar, please type them into the form of questions into the chat of the webinar, and we will be pleased to give our responses either at the webinar, or if we do not have much time here, we will respond to these questions after the webinar. Our contact details will be provided as well. So we start with what is happening in the market today. So we have seen that the last months, in March, there was an unprecedented events which were happening in the global economy and which are now called the Great Lockdown. Here is a chart which shows the research of the International Monetary Fund, which they released on the 14th of April, and in which they give an assessment of what is going to happen to the global economy after the introduction of quarantine measures in various jurisdictions. So you will see that actually they have dramatically changed the figures and dramatically changed their estimates of what is going to happen in the world economy. So effectively, if the IMF believed at the beginning of the year in January that the world economy is going to grow by at least 3%, now they effectively admit that after this great lockdown, the economy is going to shrink by 6.3%. So effectively, we are going to see an unprecedented situation in the world, which has not happened since the times of Great Depression. And it is effectively, many clients are telling us that this is uncharted territory and nobody has actually seen something like this happening in the world economy for the last 100 years. What we can say based on our experience is that such events, they are always have a reflection in the Ukrainian economy and in Ukraine. We have seen that each time something like this was happening, or some recession was happening in the world economy, Ukrainian businesses suffered greatly, and we have seen several waves of restructurings and several waves of different consequences which appeared in Ukraine. So, to cut the long story short, what we are going to tell about in the webinar today, and I see that many more participants have now joined, these will be 5 points. First of all, I will describe a few things about generally the situation in the market and what restructurings we expect to happen in the market. Secondly, we will discuss restructuring procedures and their pros and cons, and when actually restructuring is advisable to happen, and who should be looking at these at restructuring instruments. We will then describe restructuring tools, give a step plan how the restructuring should happen, and finally we will describe how we can help based on our experience of how we advised the clients what to do in such situations. As I mentioned before, we plan to do a series of such events during the course of this year, and actually in May and in June we already planned 2 additional webinars which will be devoted to different topics relating to restructuring. Specifically on May the 20th, we will do another webinar which will be devoted to foreclosure of collateral, to actually enforcement of the security documents which creditors and lenders might have in respect of Ukrainian assets, such as real estate or aircraft or any other assets which are pledged in favor of creditors in Ukraine. So note in your diaries, 20th of May will be another Wednesday, another webinar devoted to this. And then in June, 17th of June, another Wednesday, we will have another webinar which will be devoted to distressed acquisitions, actually to corporate issues relating to debt restructuring. Hopefully, maybe in June, we will hold not a webinar, but a physical event in our office, if quarantine measures will be lifted by that time. And hopefully, you will see actually us in the office, but we will also do an online streaming of the event. So you will basically be able to also participate online in such event. So moving on, what actually we see in Ukraine and what is the situation in the market for restructuring. In Ukraine, what we have seen that there have been several waves of crisis since Ukraine's independence in 1998, in 2008, and the last one in 2014, 2015, when we have seen we've had a banking crisis. And since actually the last 2 crises, Ukrainian banking system still has the legacy of non-performing loans. As you will see from these numbers which are on the screen, Ukrainian banks still have around 48% of their portfolios are NPLs, not performing loans. And most of these non-performing loans are concentrated in state-owned banks. Effectively, around 64% of all the loan portfolios in state-owned banks are non-performing loans. There have been some initiatives how to resolve the issues of non-performing loans at state-owned banks for the last 5 years. And they have not been very effective. And I think the crisis which we now have in Ukraine has specifically prompted the Ukrainian government to move forward faster. And on 15th of April, the Cabinet of Ministers has finally passed the resolution to determining the criteria how state-owned banks, in which the state holds over 75% of the shares, how they need to deal with non-performing loans. And this resolution finally determined the procedure for dealing with non-performing loans by state-owned banks by permitting such state-owned banks to actually sell such loans at a discount, which they were formerly actually afraid to do, and determine the criteria how this actually should happen, how they should assess net present value of the loans, how they can write off the loans, and many other things which actually were expected for like 5 years, but only now the Cabinet of Ministers has passed this resolution, and we hope that it will actually prompt many many state-owned banks to move forward with actually dealing with their non-performing loans and finally resolving these issues. What we also have in terms of restructuring in the market is the law on financial restructuring, which was adopted back in 2015 and became effective in 2016. And it was specifically adopted to deal with the consequences of the financial crisis which Ukraine had in 2014, 2015. Some of the first banks like Oshad Bank and a few private banks, they have used the framework of this law on financial restructuring to restructure some of their loans. However, unfortunately, not many such restructurings have actually happened. And last year, the effect of this law, which was in effect only used for 3 years, it was extended for another 3 years, and some modifications were made to the procedure of restructuring. So you see that even in 2019, as shown in this chart, there have been already some restructurings which were done not only by Oshad Bank, but also by Ukr Bank and some private banks as well. So because this law was extended for another 3 years, we hope that there will be some additional restructurings which actually will occur this year based on the framework of this law. However, if we speak generally about the market, the large corporations, large businesses in Ukraine, they have already been to a number of restructurings. So we all remember about the restructuring of Mria debts, which was probably the largest restructuring ever which happened in Ukraine. It was a bit scandalous restructuring because still the people who have made this restructuring, they still have not been punished. Hello? At the same time, what we see is that the same companies which, excuse me, I have a technical problem with the screen. We see that these companies, they are also thinking about restructuring and continuing the restructuring this year. Some of these companies which have restructured their debts in the course of last year, like Interpipe, were probably quite successful in finding the right solution just before this crisis occurred. DTEC, as you heard probably earlier this month, was the company which we expect will basically be the first one to do the large restructuring in Ukraine. Further, we know from the market that both Obolond and Ukrland Farming, they have been in discussions with the creditors for quite some time, and actually their restructurings are going to happen probably also in the course of this or next year. In respect of Ukrland Farming in particular, the process of restructuring has been discussed with the creditors for quite some time now, and we do not actually expect that it would be an easy process, because the restructuring offering which Ukreland Farming is offering to its creditors, specifically to the DGF and to the National Bank, it would require some changes in legislation and some specific effort by the governmental authorities. So other trends which we are going to see in this year, 2020, first of all, relates to the fact that the National Bank already, in reaction to the quarantine, to the pandemic, has already recommended banks to start restructuring discussions with their clients. They have already issued a specific resolution number 39 and a letter to the banks recommending them to start discussions of restructurings, although they have established some very clear criteria which clients, which borrowers can actually be entitled to restructuring. And but at the end of the day, the recommendation of the National Bank of Ukraine is that each bank needs to take its own assessment of the financial viability of the borrower, and only then we will be able to offer the restructuring terms to these specific borrowers. And also you'll see on the screen at the end of March, DTAC has already declared its wish to actually come to the market with a debt restructuring proposal. It's one of the largest companies in Ukraine, and they have obviously, because of the situation with the quarantine, with the pandemic, they have experienced a substantial deterioration of business conditions, which they have. And that's why they basically believe that they would have issues with payment of their debts. So in terms of the sectors which will be affected by the current crisis, you will see such a very helpful, I would say, table which we prepared, in which we summarize the sectors which will be most affected by the current crisis, and whether it will be high exposure, moderate exposure, low exposure, based on the perceived actually effect of quarantine on such sectors. What we see that some of the sectors which are highly exposed relate actually to the areas in which the revenue of these businesses will almost disappear or will be significantly affected by the quarantine measures or by other things. What is important to note here that we as CMS, we produce a lot of publications on the implications for each of these sectors of the current situation, current pandemic. So if you will have specific questions on these sectors, we will be pleased to share with you our materials and our analysis of the implications of the pandemic on these sectors, not only in Ukraine, but in other jurisdictions as well. So in summary of the business of why restructuring is needed, first of all, this is I would say, for the reputation of the business, this is probably in current circumstances, the only viable way to save the business and to continue the business and to continue to operate is to start discussions with the creditors, with your lenders regarding either reprofiling or management of liquidity of the business, or generally thinking of adding value in the current circumstances. For some sectors, this may be really difficult discussions, because if the revenues of the business have disappeared, or it is unpredictable when they will improve substantially, all of these issues, they need to be discussed with the creditors. And our recommendation always has been that even bad restructuring is better than basically an aggressive situation in which the creditors try to fight over the carnage of the business. So it is our recommendation that basically if any business wants to survive in this situation, they need to start discussing the situation with the creditors as soon as possible and to start implementing these restructuring measures as soon as possible. One last thing from me before I give floor to my colleagues is that we produced a lot of useful materials on our website. This relates to restructuring and to various implications of the current pandemic on the situation in the business and specifically on restructuring. We produced a very nice restructuring guide for covering most of the jurisdictions of the European Union, including Ukraine and neighboring countries. We also did very good analysis of measures which were introduced in various jurisdictions. We have also done a nice cross-border study of the moratorium which lenders which were introduced in various countries for the loans, including Ukraine as well. And we have also analyzed the impacts of financing in Ukraine of the current pandemic. So all of these materials, they are available on our website. And if you have time and opportunity, please visit this site. And of course, do not hesitate to refer to us if you will have any questions. Now I pass the floor to my colleague, Katerina, who will continue our webinar and describe the technical issues relating to restructuring.
Thank you, Igor, and hello, everyone. So what options for restructuring are available for Ukrainian businesses? We usually consider here both cross-border and local restructuring. This is because a lot of Ukrainian businesses have multi-jurisdictional and multi-level group structure, and quite often a debt is incurred by a non-resident group company, which means that this allows the Ukrainian business to also use some foreign law-governed restructuring procedures. And there are two most often used procedures. The first one is the so-called English scheme of arrangement. This was used both by Metinvest and DTEC for their bonds restructuring. And it is a statutory procedure available for foreign companies, which main benefit is that the consent to the restructuring terms can be obtained not from all creditors, but only from the majority of creditors in number and 75% of creditors in value. And the parties can actually agree to any terms they want, which needs to be also approved by English court. Another option for cross-border restructuring is by way of entering into override agreement and standstill agreement. This actually means that different creditors of a debtor under different debt documents enter into a single agreement providing the new terms of debt repayment, which overrides the original terms of debt repayment. That's why it's called override agreement. And also for the period of negotiation these terms, the parties enter into a standstill agreement, which provides waiver of all existing defaults, sets ban on declaring any new events of defaults, and ban on taking any enforcement actions. And it also sets rules for the parties' cooperation during the restructuring and the timeline of the restructuring. As regards local restructuring procedures, there are basically four options available. First one is voluntary contractual restructuring. It's not specifically regulated by law and relies on the freedom of contract concept, meaning that the parties can agree anything they want, which should not, however, contradict the law. And they can implement that in any form acceptable for them. Another option is restructuring under special law on financial restructuring mentioned by Igor. And the main feature of this procedure is that it can be initiated only by a debtor, but among the creditors, there should be at least one financial institution. And the debtor's business should also be viewed as viable, as confirmed by independent auditors. Such restructuring procedure, for example, was used by such companies as Vogue and Eldorado. Further, there is pre-bankruptcy restructuring procedure, which is regulated by Bankruptcy Code, and it is similar to voluntary restructuring, but the difference is that instead of restructuring agreement, a restructuring plan needs to be developed, and it needs to be approved not only by the creditors, but also by the court. And if such plan is approved, then it would be binding on all the creditors who took part in the restructuring, even those who voted against it. Finally, there is a rehabilitation procedure, which is available within formal insolvency proceedings. And this is probably the most strictly regulated procedure in terms of time and procedural requirements. And historically, it was not used very often in Ukraine, as opposed to similar procedures in other jurisdictions, like, for example, well-known reorganization procedure under Chapter 11 of US Bankruptcy Code. But again, given these current circumstances, and also given that the new Bankruptcy Code is now in place, this may actually change, and we may see more restructurings under both procedures provided by Bankruptcy Code. So which of the procedures to choose depends on various factors and aspects. Next slide, please, Igor. Yeah, and it also depends on pros and cons of each specific procedure. So whether it is a debtor or a creditor, first of all, one needs to understand who can initiate the procedure in such capacity, and whether there are any special conditions for such initiations. And almost all restructuring procedures can be initiated by debtor, but only voluntary restructuring and formal rehabilitation can also be initiated by creditors. As regards special conditions for initiations, again, there are no such for voluntary restructuring and pre-bankruptcy restructuring, but there are some for financial rehabilitation, like, for example, involvement of a financial institution, and for rehabilitation, which can be done only within insolvency proceedings. Further consideration needs to be given to the procedural requirements and how strict they are, so that to understand whether any specific constraints may arise, and also whether it's worth noting whether there are any requirements as to mandatory involvement of a specific type of creditors, like, for example, tax authorities, or whether the creditors who should or can be involved in the restructuring procedures actually would be decided by the parties to the restructuring. And generally, the composition of the creditors is an important thing to analyze, again, because it may affect the procedures that can be chosen. Next slide, please. Then the prevailing term of the obligations of the debtor needs to be considered, whether it is long-term or short-term. It would mainly depend on the nature of business of the debtor and viability of such a business at the stage of restructuring. And it would give understanding how quickly the majority of the obligations of the debtor would become overdue, and how long further the debtor would be able to serve its debts, and accordingly how quickly the restructuring needs to be completed. This would also give understanding as to whether a statutory moratorium or a standstill is needed, because this is what usually protects the debtor's assets and funds and gives time to the parties to agree the terms of restructuring acceptable for them. The statutory moratorium and standstill, meaning that they are enforceable by virtue of law and recognized by law, are only available in the rehabilitation procedure and in the financial restructuring procedure. In other cases, it can only be contractual on a contractual basis. And also the type of restructuring would depend on the cross-default provisions of the debtor's contracts, where those refer to only formal insolvency proceedings. This means that actually all other restructuring procedures can be used by the parties, and that would help to avoid cross-default for the debtor under its contracts. Next slide, please. Further, what needs to be considered is if there are any time limitations on the period for the negotiations of the restructuring terms, and also for the period of implementation of the restructuring that has been agreed. And there are no such limitations for the voluntary restructuring, but there are, yeah, this one, but there are such in all other restructuring procedures available. Also, a decision-making process is an important aspect to consider. And here are two things to think about. First is whether the approval of the restructuring needs to be done by all creditors, or so-called cram-down mechanism is available, meaning that consent of only part of the creditors involved is needed. And also whether it is only creditors who approve the restructuring plan or restructuring agreement, or also some third parties involved, like court or special restructuring body. Last but not the least, one need to consider whether a moratorium or ban on initiation of insolvency proceeding would be still available for the period of implementation of the restructuring plan, and also which creditors would be bound by the restructuring agreement and restructuring plan. Next slide, please. There are, of course, certain pros and cons for each procedure, and this needs to be considered specifically for each specific debtor's restructuring. Most all of the informal restructuring procedures provide more or less same level of flexibility in terms of agreeing on the terms of restructuring, and they also provide quite high chances for the debtor's recovery. What concerns confidentiality, however, this can be properly ensured only in the voluntary restructuring procedure, because in all other available options, either some notices or court decisions are published, making it publicly known that the restructuring procedure is taking place. And of course, lack of confidentiality may have a negative impact on the process and on the value of the debtor's assets. Also importantly is that what may be an advantage for a debtor may be actually a disadvantage for a creditor. Like, for example, no changes to the management of the debtor during the restructuring procedure is probably favorable for the debtor, but it may be a disadvantage for the creditors who might want to have a greater control over the debtor's business during the restructuring. And it's vice versa in relation to no fixing of debt, which is of course good for the creditors, but it's probably a disadvantage. Probably good for creditors, but is a disadvantage for a debtor. Next slide, please. As regards the constraints of the available restructuring options, they are more or less the same actually for all of them, except for the rehabilitation. This is because it is the most formal restructuring procedure and regulated by law, and actually some constraints are resolved by law. Like, for example, access to the information of the debtor, which is given to the rehabilitation administrator by virtue of law. And another aspect that differs rehabilitation procedure from all others is so-called clawback and cherry-picking right of the rehabilitation administrator. And depending on the situation, this may be an advantage because it may allow to get back to the debtor the valuable assets which were unfairly disposed previously, and may increase chances for satisfaction of the creditor's claims. But on the other hand, it may actually cause a delay to the restructuring process and finally has no success. Next slide, please. In any case, there are ways to deal with the constraints appearing during the restructuring. For example, the lack of statutory moratorium can be dealt by way of standstill agreement. And this would work where all major creditors of a debtor are involved in the restructuring process, and there are no other creditors who may have sufficient ground to file for the debtor's insolvency. As regards high cost of the informal restructuring procedures, which are usually associated with the various fees payable to the creditors and also involvement of various consultants, again, this can be negotiated and even potentially shared with the creditors. Next slide, please. With respect to difficulties of multi-party negotiations, which is relevant for all restructuring procedures, what we recommend is to form a coordinating committee of lenders, of the representatives of the major creditors, who would lead the process and take part in all negotiations instead of each separate creditor. Also, managing slow or not very proactive creditors is possible, bearing in mind that not all decisions during the restructuring process require all lenders' consent, but may be dealt with and approved by majority lenders or creditors' consent. There are also such concepts that can be used, and such as snooze you lose, which actually means that if a creditor fails to provide its consent or feedback during the set term, it will not have right to demand that its vote is taken into account for decision making. Or another option is young the bank, which means that the debtor may actually request replacement of a creditor who does not provide its consent, whereas all other creditors have agreed the terms. Fraudulent behavior is probably one of the major constraints during the restructuring process. And although it cannot be fully excluded, it still can be manageable, including by way of physical checks and involvement of various consultants. And so even if there are any constraints in one or another restructuring process, as you can see, there are various solutions and techniques that can be used to address them. Next slide, please. And moving on, we will now have a quick view on the various restructuring tools. And in addition to such classical tools like extension or debt repayment rescheduling, there are also some specific restructuring tools which are used for the restructuring procedures. For example, replacement of classic repayment scheme, which usually suggests the higher amount of repayment installments in the beginning, and which become lower toward the end of maturity. So this can be replaced with an annuity repayment scheme. Such scheme suggests that the total amount of the repayments to be done during the whole maturity of a debt are split into installment repayments which are equal for the whole term of maturity. And this actually allows the debtor to have fixed and predictable repayments, and decreases and equals financial burden over the whole maturity, which is actually one of the purposes of the restructuring. Next slide, please. Another tools, PIK interest and cash sweep, which are also widely used, and these tools were specifically used in the restructuring of DTEX bank debt, also very useful. PIK interest, which is, in other words, payment in kind interest, actually suggests that the interest, the whole amount of interest or some percentage of interest would not be paid in cash, but would be capitalized and paid at a later stage. And this frees up cash to the debtor, and the debtor can use this cash toward the most crucial business needs at the time and financial difficulties. The drawback is, however, that the rate of PIK interest is usually higher. And from the lender's perspective, there is a delay in receipt of payments of interest, usually until the end of maturity. As regards cash sweep, it actually means that there are still regular repayments that needs to be done, but they may be lower in amounts. And at the same time, the debtor has an obligation to use its excess cash or some percentage of excess cash toward prepayments to the lenders. Again, this allows the borrower to balance between the bad and good periods, especially where the business is seasonal. And at the same time, however, it involves additional monitoring and the reporting of the available and excess cash items. And there are also other tools, and I pass the word to Christina, who will discuss them in more details.
Katerina, thank you. Maybe one more thing, which before we proceed to Christina, we have in our chat, as I actually promised, our webinar will be interactive. So one of the participants, Olga, is asking, how is English scheme of arrangement recognized in Ukraine? And is it possible to provide a third-party release under the standstill agreement and get it recognized in Ukraine? So if possible, just give a very brief response because we do not have much time, but still just a few words.
Yeah, just in short. There may be issues with the recognition of this scheme. And there are various considerations to that effect, but the thing is that the scheme of arrangement is actually approved by court. So there is a court decision, and this actually gives the possibility to recognize this scheme by recognizing the court decision. And in Ukraine, so far, I think that we have not had any issues with recognizing English court decisions in Ukrainian court. So this is the way how it works. In terms of release, can you repeat, please, Igor, whether the release under standstill?
Third-party release under standstill and could be recognized in Ukraine.
I'm not sure if I understand the question correctly, but again, the standstill, it's usually, if we're talking about English law standstill agreement, it's usually a contractual obligation, and it is usually enforced by way of applying to court. So if any party does not comply with the agreement, or for example, if any term of the standstill agreement needs to be recognized in other jurisdictions, it can be done by way of court decision. And generally, again, the main principle is that the provisions of such standstill agreement just should not contradict the mandatory provisions of any relevant applicable law. The only thing, of course, is that in case of bankruptcy proceeding, the order of satisfaction of claims, for example, agreed by the parties in the standstill agreement would not be enforced in Ukraine, but there is still an option after having received payments within the bankruptcy proceeding for the parties to the standstill agreement actually to fulfill the terms of the standstill agreement by way of making payments toward one another.
Thank you, Katerina. Yes.
Yeah, we may discuss.
Thank you for these questions. We, of course, will provide responses either during the webinar, so please ask questions, or If we do not have enough time, just do not hesitate to give us these questions by email or by call after the webinar, and we will be pleased to respond. So we will continue with Christina.
Yes, thank you, Ihor. Can you please move to the next slide? Yep, thank you. So the next tool that we wanted to discuss is the Hive Ups, Hive Downs. This is the tool that was used in the widely known restructuring of Maria. What this tool means is the Hive Down is the transfer of the most valuable assets of the business upstream the structure of the company, so to the parent company of the debtor, and the Hive Down would be the move of the valuable assets of the company to the subsidiary. Often in the realm of restructuring, this tool is referred to as the divide into a good company, the company with the assets, and the bad company, the company with the debts. However, the crucial point here from Ukrainian law perspective is not to confuse this tool with the corporate split in the meaning of Ukrainian law, since in case of Hive Ups, Hive Downs, the corporate identities of the companies stay the same, and those are only assets that are moved between the companies of the same group. The way this movement is taking place is unlike in the just simple corporate split, is by sale of assets between the companies on arm's length basis. What can be moved in this tool is the assets and also possibly the clients, so the contracts that have been entered into by the debtor. Why this tool is quite useful in terms of the restructuring is first that it helps to move the core assets, the workable assets of the debtor to another company that will be able to continue a viable business. Secondly, it also allows to simplify a structure of the group in order to get rid of the companies that are not quite effective, and also to get rid of the additional costs for supporting these companies. Finally, the proceeds of the sale of this core assets can be actually used by the debtor to repay, to make repayments to the lender. So the lender gets a quite fast release. And often this tool is also combined with the purchase of the shares, since the lender may choose to become, if it has not recovered fully following the sale of the assets, it can become a shareholder in either the parent or the subsidiary company, and then gain certain control over the debtor in order to be able to get the remaining portion of the debt through operation of the company and through dividends, for example. Of course, this tool has certain pitfalls to it. First of all, it will require certain capital injections from the shareholders, either the existing ones or the lender, if the lender chooses to become a shareholder. So there should be an available money from the shareholders. Secondly, the sale of assets, it takes some time, and most likely this sale will require an evaluation in order to be able to sell the assets on the arm's length basis. Finally, often the assets that can be sold, they are part of the security package of the debtor, and therefore if the lender that wants to recover through Hive Up or Hive Down is not the one who is holding this security, there will be an additional complication in seeking the consent of the lender to such sale of assets to the subsidiary or parent of the debtor. In addition, in the bankruptcy scenario, realizing this tool would require additional consensus from all the lenders, because the sale of the assets takes place through the auction, and therefore this makes it more complicated to manage to whom the asset is actually being sold. Also, in case of the transfer of the clients, so the contracts that have been entered into by the debtor, this would of course require the consent from the counterparties under the agreements. The next tool is the transformation of payment obligation into a loan. So the obvious benefit of this option is that it allows the creditor to gain additional, have additional gain in the form of an interest charged on such a loan. However, the crucial point here is that the parties who can benefit from such a tool is limited, because from under Ukrainian law, only banks can grant interest-bearing loans, or maybe the non-resident creditors can also provide interest-bearing loans. However, in this case, there will be additional steps to be taken, such as certain currency control formalities, including the notification of this new loan to the NBU, and then control of the servicing bank and the NBU over the amount of the interest, and so on. In addition, there may be an additional complication in case there have been no actual transfer of funds into Ukraine. So, for example, this is a debt obligation arising from the purchase of goods. There will have to be a discussion with the servicing bank to show the bank that actually there is a ground to make a repayment under the loan, given that there have been no inflow of funds to Ukraine. If you can move to the next slide, please. So the next tool is debt to equity swap. As you probably know, right now it is available under Ukrainian law for both joint stock companies and LLCs. And this instrument is quite popular, mostly in restructuring the intercompany funds flows, but also it's very useful for the restructurings. And the tendency right now is that the creditors, they tend to better save the debtor rather than drive him to insolvency. And the primary reason for that is that insolvency proceedings are not very effective, while becoming a shareholder of the company may actually allow a better recovery for the lender. Of course, in Ukraine, this instrument in terms of restructuring may be slightly limited in terms of its variations that can be used. For example, Ukrainian law does not provide for such thing as purchase of shares with a discount that could allow the lender to obtain a bigger share in the debtor against writing off the lower amount of the debt. And of course, the tax consequences should be also taken into account, because in order for this tool to be neutral, the amount of the debt set off and the amount of the value of the shares acquired, they have to be equal. With respect to the other cons, what has also to be taken into account is actually the passing of the merger controls, because basically the creditor is acquiring a stake in a company in this case, and maybe certain prudential requirements applicable to the creditor with respect to which shares of which companies it can acquire. For example, if the debtor is already a distressed company. The next tool is the sale of non-key assets. This one is most straightforward one, I would say. So it basically entails the sale of the assets to the third party. However, this is not that often used, because if there were some non-key assets of the company that could be sold, that in most cases is already done prior to the restructuring discussions starting. Next slide, please. The next tool is conversion of the foreign currency debts to the national currency debt. Again, this one is more beneficial for the borrowers, because it shifts the currency risk from the creditor to from the borrower, to the creditor, because the debt becomes fixed in hryvnia. However, and this instrument can actually also be used by a limited number of creditors, due to the fact that in order for example, non-resident banks to benefit from this tool, they have to have a correspondent account with the Ukrainian bank. And in case the creditor is a non-bank entity, it will be able to grant such a loan in hryvnia only in case it's interest-free. So this slightly reduces the attractiveness of this tool for certain types of the creditors. The other two are also loans to bond swap. This one is more, this one was actually used in DTEC, where the portion of the loan facilities owned by DTEC were transformed into euro bonds of the company. And obviously this provides benefits to the lenders, given that, first of all, the bonds, these are the instruments that can be easily traded and get rid of in case of, let's say, an emergency. And also there is a more guaranteed return on the bonds in the form of the paid premium. The next slide, please. The next tool is the refinancing. This one is also quite straightforward. However, the positive thing in this instrument is that the current creditors, that they gain immediate relief. However, for the borrower, this tool may be quite expensive, because given that there is already a default on the current debt, it is for the bank that will be, or other creditor that will be refinancing the existing debt, it will be important to show the good leverage that actually provides a medium risk for the refinancing. And also, very important point would be the security documents, which in case of refinancing will most likely have to be shared with the existing creditors, who will most likely claim the seniority over the security. Performance by third parties, this is the instruments that is provided by the Civil Code of Ukraine. Which allows the debtor to put the performance of its obligation on the third party. And again, this is a convenient tool for the lenders. The key point is to check whether the agreement does not, the lender does not prohibit such a placement of performance on the third party. And also important point to take into account for the debtor is that the possibility to make a repayment by the debtor to this third party that has made the performance. In case such third party is a non-resident, there may be certain questions with respect to the currency controls, and such payment may be subject to the 2 million euro limit per year. Next slide, please. So on the next slide, this is just a very useful visualization as to how the choice of restructuring tool or procedure impacts the returns of the creditor in time perspective. So you will see that for some cases, the returns are immediate, but they are maybe lower, while in some cases, like for example, in the debt to equity swap, it may take more time to gain the return on your debt. However, it may be significantly higher in comparison to other tools. Next slide, please. So a short summary, what has to be taken into account when choosing the restructuring tool would be the currency control issues, the competition clearance necessity, regulatory constraints, and tax consequences. Following the analysis of these aspects, you will be able to choose the tool and also to choose maybe the jurisdiction in which the restructuring will mostly take place. Because, for example, the restructuring can take place on a higher level, so outside of Ukraine, on the level of the parent companies of the debtor. And most likely, of course, based on this analysis, you will probably choose a set of various tools that will help you to minimize the various risks and to mitigate them against each other. Next slide, please. So I tried to be short with respect to the restructuring step plan. It seems to be quite self-explanatory, but just in short. So first of all, you will have to analyze your indebtedness. So to analyze how many lenders, creditors you have, whether the one restructuring with one creditor does not trigger any cross defaults under agreements with other creditors, and so on. Important step in this step plan is creating a restructuring team, because there will be many various work streams to coordinate, and it is very important to make sure that there is a person responsible for each of these work streams, and there is one person coordinating everyone. Another important step would be the due diligence to make sure that before the restructuring agreement is signed, all aspects of the company that may come up at the realization stage are already taken into account. So this could be, for example, certain tax debts that were not released to the lenders right away, maybe some indebtedness that has not been taken, old indebtedness that has not been taken into account, and so on. And then the most crucial points after the signing of the restructuring agreement would be the fulfilling of the conditions precedent and conditions subsequent. For example, in the conditions subsequent, the lenders may require the company to implement approved by the lender's business plan that would allow the company to go out of this unfavorable situation that led it into the restructuring. And of course, important is to monitor and update the creditor about the situation of the company. And it is very usually often done. For example, in the detect restructuring where we were also working on, we were regularly updating the creditors about the situation in Ukraine, which significantly impacted the ability of the detect to perform. And next slide, please. So basically here is just the key points of how we usually help the clients when handling various restructurings. And as you will see, our assistance ranges from the very initial analysis of the documentation even before any discussions start with the creditors to assisting on each stage of negotiations with the creditors. And of course, drafting the documentation and choosing the most appropriate restructuring procedures and tools. Yeah, on the next slide, I see that our time is already up, but on the next slide, so you will be able to see the deals that we have been working on. So this would include also MRIA and DTEC, Globus, and various other deals. On which we, in many cases, helped with various Ukrainian law aspects relating to these restructurings, but also coordinated heavily with our UK team with respect to the whole structure of the restructuring process. So I think that's it from my side, and I think we still have some room for questions, I hope.
Thank you, Christina. Yes, unfortunately, we have run out of our planned time, and we have seen that there are some questions which were asked. I would add that from actually our experience, we know that restructuring procedures, especially for these large projects and large clients, and larger banks, they tend to be quite sophisticated processes, and in these processes, a lot of success of this process will depend on how you approach basically each step of the process. And very often we find that there are some nuances and small details which determine whether the process goes ahead or doesn't go ahead. So in effect, in many of these processes, we acted as both English and Ukrainian counsel, or as German and Ukrainian counsel. And so because we hold this webinar publicly, and we also have some law firms which have joined and are listening to us, we encourage actually our colleagues, and not only clients, to also approach us on these more difficult issues which you may be facing with your clients from the foreign law standpoint, especially in the jurisdictions where CMS operates, like in the UK, in Germany, Austria, and in other countries. Because this effectively, we have expertise in each of these jurisdictions and in many others as the largest law firm in Europe. And very often we find a lot of collaboration opportunities with the Ukrainian law firms, which actually may be working for the other party, and we for the other party in such processes. In any event, I want to stress that restructuring processes are not easy. Sometimes they take a lot of time and effort. But if this time and effort is spent, there are significant opportunities to save value for both borrowers and the creditors in such processes. We have seen several questions which were asked at the chat. First one related to the court practice relating to enforceability of scheme of arrangement of standstill and other basically mechanisms which are approved by the court and the procedure for approval. We are going to get back actually to the people who asked those questions separately after our webinar. So because we have run out of time, and also in respect of tax questions, we have a special dedicated person who works on tax questions and can comment on the tax implications of debt for equity swaps. Definitely this expertise we have available, and after the webinar we will get back to you with our responses. In any event, I thank you very much for participation in our webinar. Please do not hesitate to get back to us with any questions. Our contact details are here. And I remind you that in May and in June, we will be holding another another 2 webinars. And then after that, some more webinars until the end of the year on restructuring procedures. So you are welcome to join those webinars as well. And please also prepare questions to us, and we will be pleased to respond either during the webinar or after the webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.